Rain lashed the corrugated steel of the Busan shipping terminal, turning the industrial maze into a drowned graveyard. Kaelen, the architect Wu, pressed his back against a cold container, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts that clouded the freezing air. His custom-tailored suit was ruined, soaked through with blood and harbor sludge, but he gripped the encrypted drive like a lifeline. He had frozen the $5 billion deal, and now the very men he once enriched were hunting him with tactical precision. Above, the rhythmic thrum of a drone's rotors signaled his impending end. Then the silence broke, not with a gunshot, but with the wet thud of bodies hitting the pavement. A woman stepped through the downpour, her presence radiating a calm that defied the surrounding chaos. Sloane didn't offer a greeting. She simply raised her weapon, her eyes scanning the shadows with a predatory focus that made even the world's most powerful governments tremble. "You're late," Kaelen rasped, his logical world collapsing into the visceral reality of survival. Sloane didn't blink as she neutralized a sniper in the distance. "I'm exactly on time," she countered, her voice like grinding ice. "Now move. We have a city to burn." The golden hour in Busan usually signaled a shift from corporate dominance to neon-soaked decadence, but for Kaelen Wu, it felt like the closing of a tomb. High above the city in his glass-walled sanctuary, the air smelled of expensive espresso and the metallic tang of high-end servers. Kaelen was the man who made numbers dance. He was the forensic architect for the elite, a wizard of ledgers who ensured that blood money looked like clean dividends. He sat at his mahogany desk, his eyes reflecting the cascading green text of a secure terminal. For years, he had operated with a cold, detached logic, believing that as long as the math balanced, he was safe. But today, the math had failed. He had stumbled upon a transaction that defied every protocol of the underworld, a massive $5 billion transfer. This wasn't just a payday. It was a ghost deal, a fund earmarked for a systematic dismantling of the country's defense infrastructure, orchestrated by the very minister who claimed to protect it. Kaelen's fingers hovered over the keyboard. To authorize this was to sign a warrant for a national coup. To refuse was to sign his own death certificate. The logic that had guided his life, the belief that everything has a price, suddenly shattered. He realized that if he let this $5 billion go through, there would be no city left to hide in. With a single, trembling keystroke, he didn't just freeze the account. He encrypted the funds behind a multi-layered biometric firewall that only he could unlock. The screen turned a deep, warning red. The silence of the office suddenly felt heavy, charged with the weight of the decision he had just made. He had officially become the most hunted man in Busan. The transition from peace to violence was instantaneous. A muffled thump vibrated through the floorboards, the sound of his security detail in the foyer being neutralized with professional silence. Kaelen didn't wait for the door to burst open. He grabbed his encrypted drive, shoved it into his pocket, and lunged for the private elevator hidden behind a decorative bookshelf. As the mahogany panel slid shut, the office windows shattered inward. 4 tactical operatives, clad in matte black armor with no identifying insignia, rappelled from the roof. They moved with the grace of predators, their suppressed rifles scanning the room for the man who had just stolen their master's future. Kaelen watched through the sliver of the closing door as they began to tear his sanctuary apart. The elevator descent felt like an eternity. Kaelen's mind raced through the data points of his own survival. He knew the building's layout better than the architects, but he also knew his enemies owned the lobby. He hit the override for the basement garage, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was the flaw in his design. He had spent a lifetime building walls of code, but he had never learned how to survive a physical breach. He was a man of paper and pixels, now forced into a world of lead and gunpowder. When the doors opened, the garage was a cavern of concrete shadows. He sprinted toward his sleek, charcoal-gray sedan, the keys slick with sweat in his palm. A hail of gunfire erupted from the shadows, shattering the windshield of a nearby luxury SUV. Kaelen dove behind a concrete pillar, the impact of the bullets sending stone chips flying into his hair. They were already here. His logic-driven mind tried to calculate a path to the exit, but the variables were changing too fast. He needed someone who didn't play by the rules of math, someone who understood the chaotic geometry of war. He fumbled for his burner phone, his breath hitched in his throat. He had one contact, a name whispered in the dark corners of the financial hubs he frequented. "I have the 5 billion," he gasped into the receiver as a grenade skidded across the pavement. "But I won't make it to the street." He didn't wait for a reply as the explosion rocked the garage, throwing him against the cold concrete. He could hear the tactical units closing in, their movements methodical and relentless. He looked at the drive in his hand, the $5 billion target that now weighed more than the world. He realized then that his escape wasn't just about survival. It was the start of a war he was never meant to fight. The heat from the blast licked at his ruined suit jacket, the smell of cordite filling his lungs as he scrambled deeper into the shadows of the parking structure. Every instinct told him to run, but Kaelen Wu was an analyst by trade, and his mind was already mapping the tactical disadvantage he faced. The garage was a kill box. The men hunting him weren't just muscle, they were the cleaners, the elite enforcement arm of the very political machine he had served. They didn't just kill, they erased. They would melt the drive, burn his body, and rewrite the digital history of the $5 billion deal before the sun hit the Busan skyline. He felt the cold weight of the burner phone in his hand, wondering if the legend he had called was even real, or if he had just spent his last breath shouting into a void. He watched from behind a support pillar as the tactical team fanned out. They used hand signals, moving with a fluid, terrifying synchronicity that suggested they were more a single organism than 4 separate men. Their red laser sights sliced through the smoke, searching for the heat signature of a man whose heart was currently beating like a frantic drum. Kaelen realized he had made a mistake. He had underestimated the minister's desperation. The $5 billion wasn't just money, it was the price of a kingdom. He shifted his weight, his shoe scuffing against a piece of shattered glass. The sound was microscopic, but to the cleaners, it was a flare. 3 laser dots converged on his pillar instantly. Kaelen squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the impact of high-velocity lead. He thought of the financial reports he had once meticulously crafted, the bungalows he had planned to build, and the quiet life he had imagined before he looked too deep into the minister's ledgers. He realized then that he didn't want to die as a footnote in someone else's corruption. He wanted to be the architect of their downfall. He gripped the drive tighter, feeling the sharp edges of the plastic bite into his palm. This was his legacy. If he died here, the truth died with him. If he survived, the world would never be the same. Suddenly, the rhythmic thud of the cleaner's boots stopped. Kaelen held his breath, the silence in the garage becoming so thick it was suffocating. He waited for the flashbang, the burst of gunfire, the end. But instead, there was a new sound, a low rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from the very concrete of the floor. It was the sound of a heavy motorcycle engine, growing louder with every passing second. A pair of blinding white LED headlights cut through the smoke, illuminating the cleaners like deer in a strobe light. A figure on a sleek, matte black bike roared into the garage, defying every law of physics as it leaned into a tight turn. The rider didn't slow down. They accelerated toward the tactical team. Kaelen watched in a daze as a woman in a black leather jacket stood up on the pegs of the bike, her hands briefly leaving the handlebars to draw a suppressed submachine gun. She didn't spray bullets. She placed them. 2 shots. 2 hits. The cleaners scattered, their disciplined formation broken by the sheer audacity of the assault. This was Sloane. She was the only woman the world's governments feared because she didn't follow the rules of engagement. She rewrote them. She laid the bike down in a controlled slide, using the heavy frame as cover as she slid toward Kaelen's pillar. She didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the remaining tactical operatives. "You're late," Kaelen found himself whispering, his voice cracked with adrenaline. Sloane didn't blink. She checked the chamber of her weapon with a mechanical precision that made the minister's elite team look like amateurs. "I was busy clearing the exit," she replied, her voice as cold as the harbor wind. "Now get on the bike. We have $5 billion to protect, and the entire city of Busan is about to become a war zone." Kaelen didn't hesitate. He threw himself onto the back of the bike, his fingers digging into Sloane's leather jacket. Behind them, the sounds of sirens began to converge on the building. The architect and the operative were now bonded by a secret that could burn a nation to the ground. As Sloane kicked the bike back to life and roared toward the ramp, Kaelen looked back at the smoke-filled garage. He was no longer the man who sat behind a mahogany desk. He was a fugitive, a ghost in the making, and the $5 billion deal was just the beginning. The motorcycle hit the street, the tires screaming as they gripped the wet asphalt of the Busan waterfront. The city lights blurred into a streak of sapphire and gold, a beautiful mask for the corruption that lay beneath. Kaelen could feel the wind whipping through his hair, the cold air finally clearing the smoke from his lungs. He looked at the drive in his hand, then at the woman steering them into the heart of the night. He had hired a legend to protect a fortune, but he realized now that Sloane was protecting something much more valuable than $5 billion. She was protecting the only man brave enough to say no to a monster. As they disappeared into the labyrinth of the city's alleyways, Kaelen Wu made a silent vow. He would not just hide. He would not just survive. He would use every byte of data on that drive to dismantle the minister's empire piece by piece. The $5 billion target was on his back, but with the world's most feared woman at the helm, he was no longer running. He was hunting. The escape from the high-rise was over, but the war for Busan had only just begun. The high-rise is in flames, and the minister has just authorized a city-wide clean sweep. Kaelen is out of the building, but he's still trapped in a city that wants him dead. Can Sloane get him to the extraction point, or has the architect just hired his own executioner? Subscribe and turn on notification, not to miss the next episode. The hunt for Busan's most wanted begins now.